The sea was black, endless, suffocating. Out of that void came the first concussion. 16 inches of steel screaming through the night. The blast rolled over iron bottom. Sound like thunder dragged from the core of the earth. A junior officer on USS Washington clutched the rail so hard his knuckles bled. He had trained for months to fight with eyes and optics, but what he witnessed now defied everything he had been taught. They were shooting blind, or so it seemed. Yet every salvo landed closer until fire lit the horizon where the Japanese giant waited. In that moment, the officer felt two truths clash inside him: the terror of being hunted in darkness and the awe of realizing his ship could see what no human eye could. His Japanese adversaries had spent decades perfecting night gunnery, trusting in the sharpness of optics, the discipline of crews. They believed the dark was their weapon. Tonight, that certainty turned to ash. The irony was brutal. The Kirishima veteran of Pearl Harbor carried the finest rangefinders in the world, yet she was blind. The Washington, fresh from American shipyards, carried something Japan considered fantasy: invisible eyes, made of radar feeding a mechanical brain that never tired, never blinked. Beyond this single clash lay the wider war. Guadalcanal was not just another island. It was the hinge on which the Pacific balance turned. If Henderson Field fell, Marines would be cut off, and the Solomons would become a Japanese highway toward Australia. But if Washington's invisible fire held the line, it would mean more than saving one airstrip. It would mean that America had leaped into a different war, one fought not by tradition but by technology. And in that leap, the Pacific would never be the same again. The thunder that shattered the night over Iron Bottom Sound was only the beginning. What the Japanese believed to be their battlefield, the black waters cloaked in silence and invisibility, was about to betray them. The opening salvos were not chance, not blind guessing in the dark, but the calculated language of a machine that never missed a beat. Radar pulses invisible to the eye swept across the void, catching the outline of steel far beyond human sight. Where Japanese gunners strained to find shadows in the distance, American operators read the glowing traces on their scopes with cold precision. It was as if the Washington had been gifted with supernatural vision, piercing the night to strike an enemy that thought itself untouchable. The clash took form quickly. On the horizon, the massive silhouette of Kirishima lumbered forward with confidence, born of decades of training. Her crew had been raised on the doctrine that darkness was their ally. From the 1,920 seconds onward, the Imperial Japanese Navy had drilled relentlessly in night engagements, mastering the art of torpedo runs and surprise gunnery under starlight. To them, the Americans were clumsy amateurs, burdened by machines and doctrines too new to survive first contact. Kirishima's optical rangefinders were considered the best in the world, and her officers had faith that no enemy could match their skill once the lights went out. But the first shells from Washington tore through that illusion. 16-inch armor-piercing rounds, each weighing more than a ton, slammed into steel plating with mechanical precision. The Japanese ship staggered, flames blooming from her decks before her gunners even had a target in their sights. For Kirishima's crew, the night became a trap. Every attempt to maneuver only exposed her broadside to another radar-directed salvo. The sea lit up in orange blossoms of fire as Washington's guns hammered relentlessly, each strike a reminder that the rules of naval war had changed. Inside Washington's Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was electric. Radar operators called out bearings and distances in calm voices, their data feeding directly into the mechanical computers that calculated firing solutions in real time. The gunnery officers knew exactly where the enemy was, even as the ship twisted at high speed to avoid potential torpedoes. What Japanese doctrine declared impossible accurate fire while maneuvering was happening with deadly efficiency. Every adjustment, every turn of the helm was matched by the steady rhythm of the big guns, never losing lock on their prey. The black horizon erupted with fire where Kirishima had been, though no one could see her clearly. The sounds of secondary explosions carried across the waves as her magazines and fuel stores ignited. Japanese gunners managed only sporadic return fire shells, falling wide into the void, blind guesses in a battlefield they no longer understood. Each miss only deepened the realization that their vaunted training, their traditions of night dominance, had been rendered obsolete in a single night. The violence escalated until it was undeniable. Kirishama's proud silhouette, once a symbol of Japanese naval might, was reduced to a burning wreck. Her 14-inch guns fell silent one by one as radar-guided fire ripped through her superstructure. The sea hissed with steam and fire as twisted steel collapsed inward. Survivors scrambled into the water, swallowed by waves that glowed red from burning fuel. By the time the guns fell silent, the Japanese battleship was finished, her legacy consumed by a weapon she had no defense against. For Washington's crew, the victory was both exhilarating and sobering. Many of them had entered the night filled with dread, knowing that Japanese reputation in night fighting was unmatched. They had whispered stories of cruisers and destroyers torn apart in sudden torpedo ambushes of American ships, vanishing beneath the waves without ever sighting their killers. Yet what they experienced on this night was the inversion of those fears. They were the hunters, and the enemy was blind. The radar told them where to aim, the computers told them how to fire, and the ship itself seemed to transform into something beyond human limits. This was not merely a duel between two ships. It was the collapse of an entire doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built its strategy on the belief that careful training, superior optics, and aggressive night tactics would counter America's numerical and industrial advantage. Kirishama's destruction proved those assumptions hollow. The Americans had forged a weapon that nullified the very element Japan believed would guarantee its victories. Darkness, once an ally, had become meaningless. The symbolism could not be missed. Kirishima had been present at Pearl Harbor, a participant in the strike that had dragged America into war. She embodied the confidence of a navy that believed itself the most advanced in the Pacific. Yet here, less than a year later, she was undone, not by overwhelming numbers, but by a single battleship wielding a technology that rewrote the rules. The lesson was cruelly clear. Japan had entered a war it understood, but America was fighting a war that belonged to the future. Even the officers of Washington grasped the scale of what they had witnessed. In private accounts written after the battle, they recalled the eerie calm with which radar guided their fire, the almost mechanical certainty that each salvo would land. One gunnery officer described it as like striking an enemy already marked for death. The sailors who watched from the decks could only marvel at the ferocity unleashed by machines they barely understood. For them, the night was unforgettable. Fire in the sky, thunder rolling across the sea, and the unshakable knowledge that something fundamental had shifted. The significance of this battle went far beyond the waters of Guadalcanal. By proving that radar could make darkness irrelevant, the Americans had erased Japan's greatest tactical advantage. Every future night battle would be fought on America's terms, guided by invisible eyes that saw through smoke, storm, and shadow. Kirishima's fate was not just her own. It was a warning to every Japanese ship still afloat. The Pacific was no longer governed by skill alone. It was governed by technology, by industry, by machines that multiplied human ability beyond imagination. In the silence that followed the battle, the truth settled like ash. This was not just a tactical win, not just another ship sunk. It was a declaration, a line carved into history. The age of traditional night fighting had ended. The war had entered a new phase one in which radar and fire control computers dictated survival. Japan's navy had been caught fighting the war of yesterday. America had already stepped into tomorrow. The wreck of Kirishima was still smoldering in memory when the larger truth began to take shape. Washington's triumph in the black waters of Guadalcanal was no accident, no isolated miracle. It was the living proof of a revolution in design and doctrine that had been quietly unfolding in American shipyards for years. That night was only the first glimpse of what would come: an entire generation of battleships, built not as solitary giants, but as pieces of a greater machine, crafted to move, fight, and endure alongside the fast carriers that would dominate the Pacific. The first of these harbingers were the North Carolina-class battleships. When USS North Carolina and USS Washington emerged from the slipways in 1941, they carried more than just steel and firepower. They carried a new philosophy of war. Displacing nearly 450,000 tons when fully loaded, they were leaner and faster than any American battleship before them, capable of reaching 28 knots, speeds that allowed them to keep pace with the fleet's new centerpiece, the aircraft carrier. Their main battery 9 16-inch divided by 45 caliber guns could hurl shells the weight of cars across more than 20 miles. Yet it was their versatility that made them remarkable. Alongside that brutal punch, they bristled with 5-inch divided by 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, weapons that could shred aircraft from the sky as easily as they could rip destroyers apart at sea. What startled even their own designers was how those 5-inch guns exceeded every expectation. In tests, they proved accurate against targets moving at blistering speeds and high altitudes distances that had been thought untouchable. With the coming of radar fire control, and soon after the proximity fuse, those weapons became the beating heart of the fleet's anti-aircraft shield. North Carolina herself would prove this at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, standing guard over the carrier Enterprise and turning the sky into a graveyard for Japanese bombers. For the first time, American sailors began to believe that the ocean itself could be defended, that the carriers could survive beneath a dome of flame and steel. Yet the North Carolinas were only the beginning. The Navy still labored under the weight of treaty limits, the restrictions of the Washington and London agreements that capped displacement and firepower. Within those tight parameters, American engineers achieved something extraordinary. The South Dakota class, a quartet of battleships that would be hailed as the finest treaty battleships ever built. USS South Dakota, USS Indiana, USS Massachusetts, and USS Alabama embodied the American knack for squeezing more into less. At 3,500 tons, they carried the same 16-inch guns as their larger cousins, but wrapped in an armor scheme of unprecedented strength. A belt of 12, 2 inches sloped at an angle, combined with 6 inches of deck armor, gave them protection equal to or greater than ships half again their size. But the genius of the South Dakotas was not raw power alone. Their design revealed a mindset utterly different from that of their Japanese adversaries. Where Japan built individual ships to be dueling champions, the United States built weapons to serve the fleet as a whole. Compact, heavily armored, and bristling with dual-purpose guns, the South Dakotas were crafted to be guardians. Their role was not glory in solitary combat, but integration, moving in formation with carriers weaving their anti-aircraft fire into a larger shield, standing as the backbone of vast task forces. It was a design philosophy that turned warships into parts of a system, each one amplifying the strength of the others. When the last treaty shackles were cast off, the full force of American industry roared into existence with the Iowa class. If the North Carolinas were pioneers and the South Dakotas refinements, the Iowas were the unleashed vision of what a modern battleship could be. USS Iowa, USS New Jersey, USS Missouri, and USS Wisconsin stretched 887 feet from bow to stern, the longest battleships ever built. Fully loaded, they displaced over 5,600 tons, but despite their massive bulk, they moved like predators, 33 knots at flank speed, faster than many cruisers, fast enough to race alongside Essex-class carriers at full stride. Their firepower was a fusion of brute force and precision. 9 16-inch divided by 50 caliber Mark 7 guns could throw shells nearly 24 miles each, impact capable of digging a crater 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Yet these leviathans were not built to slug it out in duels as Yamato and Musashi had been. They were built to protect, to escort, to weave their massive anti-aircraft broadsides into the carrier screens that projected American power across the Pacific. 40-40mm Bofors and quad mounts, dozens of 20mm, Oerlikons, and later, an ever-growing suite of rapid-fire defenses turned their decks into fortresses bristling with fangs. Against kamikaze swarms, they became floating citadels, their combined fire forming walls of flame that consumed attackers long before they reached their targets. The very speed of the Iowas was a weapon in itself. Japanese intelligence could scarcely comprehend that a battleship might maneuver at 33 knots. Their doctrines assumed such giants could only lumber at 21. To see one of these sleek monsters appear unexpectedly on the horizon, racing into formation with carriers, was to realize that every assumption of timing, distance, and battle rhythm had been shattered. Together, these three classes told a story of intent. America was not building battleships to duel alone in open water. They were not monuments to singular power, but instruments of a system. They existed to escort carriers to shield the heart of the fleet to strike where needed and endure under fire. Each ship was a node in a web, tied together by radar, by communication, by doctrine, that prized coordination above individual prowess. Where Japanese warships fought as proud champions, American battleships fought as brothers in arms, their strength magnified by unity. This philosophy would define the war's endgame. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea at Leyte Gulf at Okinawa, these fast battleships became the pillars of the task forces, their guns booming outward in arcs of destruction, while their radars guided fighters into swarms of attackers. No longer were they simply big guns afloat. They were integral to the choreography of an industrial giant at war. The message was unmistakable. America had taken the battleship, the symbol of individual naval might, and transformed it into a guardian of the system, an armored arm of the carrier age. Alone, each was formidable. Together, integrated into the task force, they were unstoppable. The rise of America's fast battleships was only half the story. Steel alone could not explain why giants like Hiroshima crumbled in the dark while ships like Washington struck with inhuman accuracy. What truly shattered Japanese naval supremacy was not just the design of hulls or the caliber of guns. It was the invisible revolution humming inside those ships. Radar proximity fuses dual-purpose batteries and a new brain for the fleet. The Combat Information Center rewrote the very logic of naval war. The Pacific was no longer a contest of eyesight, instinct, and individual ships. It became a battlefield, ruled by sensors, data, and networks, where America's machines turned the ocean itself into a hunting ground. Radar was the first and most devastating change. Where Japanese commanders believed night and weather shielded their movements, American fire control radars, like the Mark 8, pierced through the void with unblinking precision. These machines sent electromagnetic pulses into the blackness, reading the echoes to pinpoint range and bearing with an accuracy no human eye could match. For centuries, naval combat had demanded visual contact, spotting a mast on the horizon, tracking the flashes of enemy guns. Radar burned that tradition away. On Washington, operators in a dim humming compartment could track Hiroshima's approach long before her silhouette broke the skyline. They fed coordinates directly to mechanical computers that adjusted gun elevation and bearing in real time. When the ship heeled in evasive maneuvers, the solution held steady. The guns roared and the shells found their mark. The impossible had become routine. What this meant in practice was nothing short of terrifying. Japanese officers trained their crews to fire at long range only while holding steady courses. A zigzagging ship they believed could not shoot accurately. Washington proved that doctrine obsolete. American battleships could shoot and maneuver simultaneously, turning their very survival tactics into offensive strikes. Darkness, smoke, rain, even evasive action, none of it mattered. As long as radar swept the seas, the target could be seen, measured, and destroyed. The fear this instilled was profound. Japanese veterans, once confident masters of night battle, now faced an enemy that treated midnight as if it were noon. But radar was only the beginning. The American fleet's deadliest weapon was not its giant 16-inch guns, but the humble 5-inch divided by 38 dual-purpose mounts that lined every fast battleship. Compact, reliable, and fast-firing, they were the workhorses of the fleet. Before the war, no one imagined that such medium-caliber guns could form the backbone of naval air defense. Yet when paired with radar guidance and later the revolutionary proximity fuse, they became the nightmare of Japanese aviators. The VT, or variable time fuse, was a miracle of science disguised as a shell casing. Inside each round lay a miniature radar set no larger than a flashlight bulb that detonated the explosive charge when an aircraft came within lethal range. No more direct hits were required. A shell only needed to pass close, and the airburst would shred wings, tear engines apart, or send shrapnel scything through cockpits. Before VT, American gunners needed more than 1,000 shells to bring down a single plane. With VT, the average dropped to around 300. Against massed kamikaze attacks, this efficiency meant survival. Entire squadrons of suicide planes were cut down before they reached striking distance. For the Japanese, the effect was devastating. Pilots who had once sneered at American gunnery now described defensive barrages that seemed almost supernatural. Bursts of fire erupted exactly where they flew, as if the shells anticipated their movements. At battles like the Eastern Solomons and later the Philippine Sea, attackers dove into what they thought were openings, only to be met by walls of invisible, radar-guided explosions. They called it a death trap, a killing sky. The phrase Great Mariana's Turkey Shoot was not American arrogance. It was the bitter reality of Japanese pilots sent into a storm of VT-fused shells and radar-directed fighters. Yet even radar and VT were not enough on their own. Their true power came from the way America integrated them through a new nerve center, the Combat Information Center, or CIC. Born from desperation during the Guadalcanal campaign, the CIC was a simple idea with revolutionary consequences. Instead of each ship fighting in isolation with captains relying on what their eyes could see or radio messages could convey, the CIC collected data from every radar, every lookout, every contact, and turned it into a live map of the battle. In a cramped, dimly lit room, lined with plotting boards and glowing screens, officers tracked friendly ships, enemy formations, aircraft raids, and even weather. This was the battlefield brain, where chaos became clarity. When Japanese aircraft launched mass raids, CIC officers vectored American fighters to intercept before the enemy could even see the fleet. Destroyers on radar picket duty called in enemy waves, and CICs coordinated the layered defense fighters first, then long-range 5-inch barrages, then the storm of Bofors and Oerlikons closer in. No longer did individual ships respond piecemeal. Now dozens of vessels fired as one organism, a coordinated machine of steel and fire. The difference in philosophy was stark. The Imperial Japanese Navy prided itself on individual initiative, the skill of its ship captains, and the training of its gunners. But this brilliance functioned in isolation. Their ships communicated by signal flags or unreliable radios. Their radars, when they finally appeared, were crude search sets without fire control integration. In contrast, American ships fought as if wired to a single mind. One radar contact became every ship's knowledge. One plotted enemy move became the fleet's shared response. It was system warfare before the term even existed. This was why Japanese commanders began describing American fleets as inhuman, mechanical, unstoppable. To them, it seemed as though their enemy always knew where they were always fired before they could strike, always anticipated their tactics. The truth was simpler but no less damning. America had industrialized information, turned electrons and circuits into weapons as decisive as torpedoes or bombs. The transformation was not abstract. It saved lives and won battles. On the night Washington sank Hiroshima radar, let her strike first and strike true. At the Eastern Solomons, radar-directed 5-inch batteries shredded Japanese aircraft that had once terrorized carriers. At the Philippine Sea, CIC coordination turned 473 incoming planes into wreckage, with 243 shot down in a single day. Each of these moments traced back to the same truth: technology had erased Japan's advantages and replaced them with America's dominance. By the time kamikaze waves hurled themselves against the American fleet at Okinawa, the pattern was set. The sacrifice of Japanese pilots was terrible, but the machines arrayed against them, radar pickets, VT shells, integrated defenses, reduced even suicide tactics to near futility. Barely 14% of kamikaze aircraft reached their targets. Of the ships struck, less than 10% sank. The rest fought on scarred but unbroken, sustained by systems that multiplied human endurance with industrial power. This was the new war, fought not by lone champions, but by networks. American ships were no longer individuals. They were nodes in a system of sensors, fuses, and coordination that stripped uncertainty from battle. Radar saw computers, calculated CICs, commanded, and the fleet acted as one. The Japanese entered each clash armed with the faith of tradition. The Americans entered armed with the future. And in the clash between past and future, the outcome was inevitable. The full measure of America's technological leap was not revealed in isolated duels, but in the furnace of great battles, where entire fleets clashed and the fate of oceans hung in the balance. The tools that had humiliated Hiroshima and shredded, isolated Japanese raids would now be tested on a scale the world had never seen. The Eastern Solomons, the Philippine Sea, the brutal campaigns along the Marianas and Okinawa. These were the proving grounds where radar proximity fuses and the Combat Information Center fused into something terrifyingly efficient. The results were nothing less than the dismantling of Japan's strategic foundations. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 was the first warning shot. USS North Carolina, the pioneer of America's fast battleship doctrine, sailed as shield to the carrier Enterprise. For hours, waves of Japanese aircraft lunged at the task force, veteran aviators confident they could smash the American carriers with the same skill that had crippled Pearl Harbor. Instead, they were met by a storm of 5-inch divided by 38 fire radar, guided and merciless. In a span of 8 minutes, North Carolina's gunners claimed between 7 and 14 enemy planes, their bursts detonating with a precision that stunned survivors. To the pilots who escaped, it seemed impossible. American ships that had once flailed helplessly against torpedo bombers now fired as if they could see through the sky itself. The carrier Enterprise, battered but alive, owed her survival to the dome of fire thrown up by her escort. It was the first time Japanese commanders glimpsed the death of their advantage in the air. But the lesson grew sharper at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, the battle that would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Here Japan staked everything on a decisive blow, launching 473 aircraft in massive waves from the remnants of their mobile fleet. They hoped to crush Task Force 58 to halt the American advance on the Marianas and to regain momentum in a war that was slipping away. Instead, their strike groups flew into the jaws of the most integrated naval defense the world had ever seen. Radar pickets detected the raids hundreds of miles out. Combat Information Centers plotted their courses, vectored fighters into position, and coordinated the layers of defense with chilling efficiency. American Hellcats intercepted at precise points, guided by instructions that seemed omniscient to the enemy. Those who broke through met the wall of 5-inch VT-fused fire detonations that filled the sky with invisible shrapnel. Then came the heavier barrages from the fast battleships, the quad 40mm Bofors, the rapid-firing Oerlikons, all weaving an interlocked net of destruction. By the battle's end, 243 Japanese aircraft were torn from the sky in a single day. American losses, 15. The disparity was so grotesque that Japanese pilots, once proud heirs of the world's finest naval air arm, described the experience as suicide without honor. Their formations disintegrated before even reaching bombing range, cut apart by defenses that anticipated their every move. To them, it felt as though the Americans were not fighting as men, but as machines, guided by an unseen intelligence that always knew where to strike. The Philippine Sea was not just a tactical defeat. It was the burial of Japan's naval aviation as an effective force. The carriers that had once terrified the Pacific became floating coffins, unable to launch strikes that could reach their prey. Even where Japanese aircraft could not reach, the power of American fire control was felt. The great shore bombardments that paved the way for invasions, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, demonstrated that radar was not only an eye in darkness, but a scalpel of destruction. Iowa-class battleships with their 16-inch divided by 50 caliber guns could rain down shells weighing 1,900 pounds onto precise coordinates regardless of weather or visibility. Japanese defenders hiding behind smoke screens or counting on storms to blind their enemies discovered that nothing could conceal them. American shells fell with mechanical regularity, obliterating bunkers, supply depots, artillery positions, even command centers, buried deep in rock. Survivors described the bombardments as if the earth itself turned against us. Craters 50 feet wide scarred the island's defenses, pulverized before Marines set foot on the beaches. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Veteran garrisons drilled in the tactics of concealment and sudden counterattack realized their efforts were useless. The night no longer offered sanctuary. Smokescreens no longer misled the gunners. The storm no longer shielded movements. American warships had transcended the natural world, fighting as if the sea and sky themselves bent to their will. The terror spread through Japanese ranks everywhere they looked. Their hard-earned advantages crumbled. This pattern repeated itself until it became a nightmare rhythm. In the Marianas, Japan's night-fighting cruisers, once the pride of their navy, were butchered by radar-guided gunnery before they could close to torpedo range. In the Philippines, Japanese aircraft launched desperate waves only to be torn apart before reaching their targets. At Okinawa, kamikazes hurled themselves by the hundreds into the inferno, but radar pickets and coordinated defenses reduced their sacrifice to percentages too small to change the outcome. Only a fraction ever reached the carriers. Fewer still sank ships. Each failure deepened the realization that the Empire's tools of war were obsolete. The cumulative effect was staggering. Within the span of 2 years, Japan lost its supremacy in every domain it had once dominated. The night belonged to radar. The skies belonged to VT-fused shells and coordinated fighter direction. The shorelines belonged to precision bombardments that erased defenses before the first amphibious wave landed. What remained was courage alone, and even that was squandered against machines and doctrines that stripped it of effectiveness. By the time American fleets stood off the Japanese home islands, the outcome was not in doubt. The fast battleships, the carriers, the radar pickets, and the CICs operated as a single living organism. Their firepower was overwhelming, but more importantly, it was integrated, relentless, systematic. Japan's warships, designed to duel as solitary champions, were helpless against an enemy that no longer fought as individuals, but as an interconnected system. The great battles had proven the truth. Written in fire and steel, every advantage the Japanese once claimed was gone. Darkness no longer hid them. Air power no longer favored them. Coastal defenses no longer delayed their enemy. One by one, their pillars of strategy collapsed until only desperation remained. And desperation would take its final form in kamikaze attacks, a brutal admission that the old ways had failed. But even the suicide planes hurling themselves in fire could not turn back the tide. For the Americans had transformed the Pacific into a battlefield of machines where human courage was measured not in blindness and instinct, but in coordination and technology. Against such an enemy, there was no path to victory. By the time the fires of Okinawa faded, the Japanese high command understood what their sailors and pilots had already whispered in despair. The war they had prepared for no longer existed. Every strength they once claimed, night-fighting air superiority, decisive torpedo ambushes, had been ripped away by machines that saw in darkness shells that exploded without direct hits, and fleets that moved as a single mind. What remained to them was desperation, and desperation took the form of kamikaze. The suicide planes were not a strategy, but an admission of defeat. Veteran pilots were gone. Their replacements rushed into cockpits with barely enough training to land. Aircraft carriers that once symbolized Japanese power had become floating targets stripped of the air groups that gave them meaning. So commanders turned to sacrifice. Young men hurled themselves into walls of radar-directed fire, their courage undeniable, but their effect negligible. Barely 14% ever struck their targets. Less than 10% of the ships hit actually sank. Each wave ended the same way, burning wreckage on the sea, the futility of flesh against circuitry, tradition against technology. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the United States became an arsenal that no empire could match. Shipyards that once built merchant freighters now launched fast battleships and Essex-class carriers in a rhythm that seemed unstoppable. Electronics factories poured out radar sets and proximity fuses by the millions, transforming scientific breakthroughs into battlefield dominance. Procurement for advanced electronics rose from $60 million in 1942 to nearly $500 million by 1945. More than 100 companies across America produced 20 million VT fuses, each one a tiny miracle that turned the skies into killing zones. Where Japan struggled to replace a single carrier or rebuild a squadron, America flooded the ocean with new ships, new planes, new weapons. It was not only a war of men, it was a war of machines, and only one side could feed them. The culmination of this technological revolution came not in another battle, but in a moment of silence. September 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japanese officials walked past radar arrays, fire control towers, and the very guns that had reduced their fleets to wrecks. They laid down their signatures beneath the shadow of technology they had never learned to counter. For them, Missouri was not just a vessel of surrender. She was the embodiment of the enemy's advantage: speed, radar, networked firepower, and the industrial will to build such ships by the dozen. The war ended not only in defeat, but in revelation that Japan had fought yesterday's war while America had already moved into tomorrow's. That is the meaning of the Pacific War's final act. Japan entered 1941 believing skill, courage, and tradition could overcome numbers. By 1945, those virtues had been nullified by a new kind of warfare. The United States had forced the world into an era where machines amplified men beyond imagination, where fleets fought as systems, and where darkness itself offered no cover. The Pacific did not just see the defeat of an empire. It saw the birth of modern war. The night when Washington's guns tore through Hiroshima was more than a battle. It was the signal that the old ways of war had died. From the rise of fast battleships to the invisible power of radar and proximity fuses, America transformed the Pacific into a battlefield where skill and tradition could no longer stand against technology and unity. Japan's courage was real, but courage without adaptation led only to ruin. Factories, scientists, and sailors working as one created a force that rewrote the rules of conflict. That lesson does not belong only to history. Every generation faces the choice of clinging to the past or daring to fight the war of tomorrow. If we forget what was proven in the Pacific, we risk being outpaced by those who embrace change. The future will not wait. It demands vision, courage, and the will to act before it is too late.